What's it take to enroll them into the mission of the company? That's where we ought to aim, instead of saying what's wrong with Gen Z and if they would just be like us, our life would be easier. Yeah, duh, everything. That conversation's easy one to have, but it's not the one a leader's having. A leader's saying, how do I break through? How do I make a difference with? I mean, if you want to go lead something, otherwise, whatever, inherit the future of your complaints. You'll be complaining about the same thing 6 months from now. Am I being punchy all of a sudden? I'm realizing I'm being a bit punchy.
I love it.
You all listeners, I love you. That's why we're having this conversation. Stop being so damn normal.
Are you struggling to find ways to connect to your Gen Z employees and team members? Are you confused about what motivates them? Then this episode of the Naked Leadership Podcast is for you. Hello, my friends. My name is Chad, and this is the Naked Leadership Podcast, high-stakes conversations for relentless company founders. My co-hosts and I have over 6 decades of combined experience in leadership coaching, and this podcast is where we explore it all. There's no conversation too risky. In this episode, I sit down with Adrian and Dan, and we have a bit of a chat about leading Gen Z in the workforce. We talk about ways to encourage their specific mindset and how to understand their PVI, personal vested interest. Let's dive in. Gentlemen, so great to be with you. How are both of you?
Oh, so great.
Excellent. Thanks.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about this conversation. I think I've mentioned on the podcast, I lead the discussion, a once a month discussion at a local mastermind here that we've put together of business owners. And the most asked for topic in that group of 18 founders in my area was, how do we work with Gen Z? The younger workforce that's here. So when we talk about Gen Z, we're talking about 26 years old and younger. They're coming into the workforce. A lot of them are graduating with their degrees. They're jumping into companies, or have been for a while. And there are some unique characteristics, I think, that are defining, at least being, and I don't know how to have this conversation without painting with some broad brushes. So I just want to be clear about that right at the beginning of this conversation. We're going to paint with some broad brushes. That's okay, I think, especially because we're going to dive into principles. We always do. And so the principles are universal, whether or not an individual falls into each one of these characteristics that we're talking about. So I just thought that was fascinating when I polled our group of the most pressing conversation they wanted to have in this mastermind was, how do we lead the younger generation of the workforce? So I wanted to bring that conversation to our podcast because I think it's interesting. I also know that you guys are going to both bring things to the conversation that I wasn't even thinking about or considering. So when I did some follow-up inquiry on this idea of leading the younger generation, as I was asking questions, almost all of them said, well, it's just impossible to find good work these days. I can't help but think that's probably a conversation that has happened in every generation, isn't
it? Yeah. Well, I think, we're talking, to some of your intro points, we're talking culturally, right? So culturally speaking, which is, what is that? It's the set of norms of conversation, is the net, if you will, or the bowl, if you want to, or whatever, kind of the container in which activity comes out of. And each generation's got its kind of trends of what the norms are and what's socially acceptable, what's expected, what's championed, what's shunned, all those types of things. Those are distinct among generations, at least at some time. And then, generations then play off one another over time. But, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about for sure, back in 1934, there were people that were very Gen Z-ish. We just don't talk about it that way. Now we paint with the big brushes and we lose the individuals. So I think it's a great conversation. I hear a lot of similar complaints when it comes to people, and it's a very socially acceptable complaint.
Yes.
And very like gets you a nice long head nod from somebody else, or a whole big story, a whole big long story about, oh, let me tell you how hard it is for me. A complimentary complaint, if you will. When somebody's saying it's hard to find good people these days, they're like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this interview I had last week.
It's like, what's the purpose of the complaint, right? Like what is it getting you to complain about this? And like what I hear you saying, Adrian, and what I do see often, even in this mastermind group of really high level operating, powerful, hard driving people, is like almost that connection with each other of like, oh yeah. Isn't it hard? Yeah. It's hard. You're right. It is hard.
Misery loves company, and look how hard our lives are, and look at what we can't do about it. So here we are. I mean, it's, let's just say it is. Let's just say it is. Okay, great. So what? Now what? Like, what are we going to do about it is kind of the most applicable question for us. I mean, we could go explore the complaint and keep exploring what's wrong with Gen Z, but that's what most people do. And if you do that, you're not being a leader. Being a leader says, I'm going to stand up and stand in and push in and challenge and support and take on any kind of circumstance that's coming my way for the sake of the mission. So anyway, so we'll perk our ears up. If we're leading, if we want to lead our way through, let's just call it complexity, with how to engage the mindset and the socially acceptable terms of the Gen Z generation right now. What's it take to enroll them into the mission of the company? That's where we ought to aim, instead of saying what's wrong with Gen Z and if they would just be like us, our life would be easier. Yeah, duh, everything. That conversation's easy one to have, but it's not the one a leader's having. A leader's saying, how do I break through? How do I make a difference with? I mean, if you want to go lead something, otherwise, whatever, inherit the future of your complaints. You'll be complaining about the same thing 6 months from now. Am I being punchy all of a sudden? I'm realizing I'm being a bit punchy.
I love it.
You all listeners, I love you. That's why we're having this conversation. Stop being so damn normal. Stop being normal. I just get, anyway, I get fired up around. It's like, just talking to a guy yesterday who was full of all of his stories about why he couldn't do something. And I said, man, can you just repeat after me? So what? Because every time I ask you a question, you tell me another story about why you can't. And I just say, so what? So what to that? Who gives a shit? And let's care about something that matters. So anyway, how do we break through to this kind of social norms of the moment? That's what I'd like to focus the conversation on. I'm guessing that's really what people want to hear if they're up for generating something new for themselves. So maybe it'd be good for us just to share some of the complaints that are here about Gen Z.
Yeah. Well, Dan, did you have any, just at the start, it looked like you maybe had some framing that you were thinking about.
I don't want to get.
As I was going on my tirade. Sorry, Dan.
I didn't want to get bulldozed into that. The bugger, I'd be down the cement there in the concrete.
Why don't you shut up, Dan? Back to me.
That's enough. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? The Gen Z is, they're called the Zoomers, but they're the most technically literate generation ever.
Oh, for sure.
And so one of the things that I was reading an article the other day about the Gen Z, and that they absorb information quickly and they cut to the quickly, and they're willing to call things out quickly. They also are, if you're going to attract them, if you're going to connect with them, you better have a sense of a global impact, because they're very sensitive to what they're doing here and how it affects the rest of the people on the planet. So they're big vision, and they're niche oriented. They have very interested, they're interested in the niches they're in and how those niches influence culture, how those niches influence the world. And I think to many of the boomers and after, that comes across a little threatening, because I think they tend to, I think the generation just as a whole, and again, these are generalizations and there's always individuals, but as a generation as a whole, they're going to be more skeptical. because they're taking in more information. They're not going to be easily taken in, and you're going to need to be able to have some substance to connect and walk with them.
Not all
Yeah.
information is equal.
That's right.
I mean, you think about
they
being
know
on the
that.
internet. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking about to the thought of like, what's the complaint? The complaint, by the way, I love your take there, Dan. And the complaint I hear a lot is like how entitled they are. And
Yes.
I like the fact, and I was just reading an article on Stanford as we're sitting here, they value direct communication, which you said, Dan, and I find that really interesting. There are a bunch of, I know there are things that we settle for, and definitely in corporate culture, less so in entrepreneurial culture, like the people that we like to talk to, but in corporate culture, being being unclear is actually very socially acceptable.
Ambiguous.
And being ambiguous, right? And covering your ass and not putting people's names on things and not being direct, and all that is very socially acceptable. So it makes sense why a Gen Zer gets in a conversation and isn't satisfied with the level of distinction.
Right.
And they want distinction. Give me distinction. And that can come off entitled, like, hey, I need distinction to move forward. It's also just a principle. It's also like a pretty good idea, but it's going to come up against maybe the group think that if we have a meeting that has no outcomes, we had a successful meeting. A Gen Zer might be in a meeting and saying, hey, this hour-long meeting can actually be 15 minutes. Would you just do two things? Tell me why this is important, and then tell me what to do.
And don't
What do you
call me,
expect?
text it, damn it.
Yeah, that's right. Why are we meeting? I have to walk down the hallway? Just text that to me. Yeah. So ironically, there's an effectiveness and efficiency in some of these principles we're talking about here that I think get brushed away because of, another prominent or prevalent complaint is kind of their preciousness of the Gen Z. You know, it's like there's a much more
like a fragility.
Fragility. And I'm thinking like they really value what most people would call like a work-life balance or a desire after self-care or personal development, that kind of thing. And it seems like less apt to sign up to be a company man.
Yes.
Now that's a threat if you're a company man looking for your next company man, and all of a sudden they don't want to sign up for that game you're offering them, and you might call them precious because they want to go do a yoga retreat, or they want to go whatever, show up to work at 10 o'clock and leave at 6 instead of show up to work at 8 and leave at 5, whatever. Yeah, that might come off precious, but it actually just comes off distinct about what their interests are.
Right on.
They're probably, they are, of all the generations, freer or less anchored into the industrialized mindset where people are widgets trying to get. So they're going to resist that. And like any generation, right, they're going to have people that are really diligent and want to think through what they're up to and are going to be very particular. Then you're going to have those who are going to think more generalized and kind of go along with the culture. But my sense is, and the ones I've talked to, that if you are substantial and able to contain what they have to say, learn from them, I've found that they're real willing to work alongside. They want their voice heard. And I think, when you get alongside somebody and you get in the field and you're doing something together and they recognize your competency, well then, okay, you're going to find somebody who's going to be much more up for it. But I think the biggest value that I've found is that they're not just going to be industrialized. They're not going to be necessarily, part of the group unless they get
the herd. Yeah,
part of the herd.
Dan,
they're less herd conscious.
Dan, I think of the story you tell about your grandfather hiring you to make the lawn green.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling that real quick? Just because I want to draw a line.
Sure. When I was a young kid, I was about 9. I think I was 8 or 9, maybe 10. And I wanted to play I was playing baseball and I wanted a new glove. And so I went to my grandfather and said, my dad asked him for some money to get a glove. He said, go get your own money. And then I went to my grandfather, asked him some money. And he said, why would I give you money? And he said, I'll tell you what, you make my yard green and I'll pay you $100 a month. Now, in 1964 or 65, that's a lot of money. That's like a lot of, that's some serious, I'm going to buy a team, not just get a glove. And I'm pretty jacked. So, I'm all excited, and I'm over there, and every day I'm mowing the lawn, I'm fertilizing, I'm watering, and I kill everything. And it's just not looking good. So I come back in after the first 2 weeks, and I ask him for my money, and he gives me a swat in the back of the head. And he goes, "What's wrong with you? Give you money. You haven't done your job." So I'm hurt, but I don't guess, he's the patriarch, okay, got it, left, go home weeping. My father goes, "What's wrong with you?" And I tell him, "Papa spanked me," or basically told me he was going to do this. I give him the whole story. Then he hits me. So my dad calls my grandfather, and he comes back in the bedroom, gives me a swat in the head himself. And I go back, he goes, "Go back and talk to your grandfather." So I go back and I ask my grandfather why. He does, "Why'd you do that?" And he said, "Look, man, I hired you to make the grass green, not to work hard. I don't care how much work you do or how little work you do. I care that the grass is green. I want you, if you cared about that, then you'd be doing your job." And all of a sudden, I'm coming over maybe twice a week and doing what I have to do, and, planning it out. And it took me about a month to get the first pay, but it worked out. And I did it for probably almost a year. And then, went and got a job in a movie theater but it was some of the best training I ever got.
Yeah. The line I want to draw there, I love that story. You tell that story in The Revenant a lot. And I love that story because it's connected to results, obviously, right? We can all get there without even it being said, is that your grandfather was focused on the results. You were focused on the work or the time that you were going to put in, the process. And I think a lot of, Adrian, you brought up entitlement. What I see is like, a lot of what's being interpreted as entitlement is really this generation just saying, can we just focus on the results? Yeah. Like, can we just make the results happen? It doesn't matter if I'm in the office. It doesn't matter if I'm starting work at 10 and ending at 3. It doesn't matter if I have the yoga retreat, as long as the results are there. Can we just focus on that?
Well, and if it is entitlement, so what? Well, it's going to be different from individual, but to blanket a whole generation as entitled is pretty powerful.
The only constant in an organization like yours is change. I want to take just a second to tell you about the change imperative written by our very own Dan Tacchini. How do you personally relate to change in your business? Does it feel like a threat at times? Does it ever feel like you can't keep up with it, or that it never happens fast enough? Are there certain players on your team that resist change and keep your company stuck? Do you know how to lead people through the change that your vision requires? If not, it's impossible to take this thing to the next level. Growth, change, and transition, these intersections often come with confusion, frustration, and resistance. They don't have to. You can flip those experiences into clarity, confidence, and alignment with the Change Imperative ebook. It is the instructions for innovating with your team. So go ahead and click the link in the show notes to get your free copy of the Change Imperative now, and feel confident about creating the change in your company necessary to go to the next level. Now, back to the conversation.
So I think to your point is to slow down, and probably if you're the one vetting new talent, it might be time to update your own operating system about what that takes to make sure this works. And it's part of what you're talking about, Dan, which is to vet the cultural, the kind of the internal biases, what their personal interests are, how they like to work, what do they expect of a boss, what does support even look like, what does challenge look like, how much do you need help with this versus that? And, it might be very distinct from your other teammates that have been there 5 years. It probably will be. And it's good to know early so that you're actually, that points to another thing is if leaders are willing to be agile, they're willing to actually lead somebody from where the person is, not lead them like they like to lead.
Yeah.
because
right on.
everybody needs other things. Everybody needs distinct things.
That's right.
I mean, most people we work with, we've got this Harrison assessment thing we use, which vets interests and preferences of players on the field. One of them that's really telling, and almost across the board, is there's a score called Once a Capable Leader, and that's usually really high for people we work with. At least I've seen that as a trend.
Yep.
I don't know if you've seen that, Dan, as a trend as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, once a capable leader, which means that when I look up, I need to really respect the person I'm working for.
Or I can't work right. I just have a hard time. I can't work with them.
Right on. But that indicates a certain type of connection, right? So I like to be connected to the leader I'm working for. Other cultures might not, right? I do come across people. I don't coach a lot of Gen Zers, but I do come across people that they don't give a shit. They're cool. Whatever that person's doing, that's fine, as long as they get out of my way, or as long as they're not too much dabbling, with what I'm up to. And so anyway, vetting out that conversation on what they expect from leadership. And you better believe that there's grumblings among Gen Z about everybody else as well, about what it's like to try to enter the workforce. And they don't come in as a blank slate either.
Well, there's a Gen Z poet. His name is Adrian. And I'm kind of clued in a little bit because I have kids and their friends. And this poet, I think he captured, he says, "We're not born to accommodate tyranny over our hearts, minds, bodies, or souls. We are here to confirm an abundance of love, inspired possibilities greater than such restrictions." I thought that was really powerful. So that it's a guy, they're looking for, they get that there is, they're looking for how do we express ourselves outside of how we're historically told to, given historically what's happened brought us to this point of catastrophe or at least perceived catastrophe.
Yeah.
So, as a generation or six behind them, it seems that it would behoove my generation, the boomers, to take that into account and not condescend, but actually learn, as well as, because if I learn, I can teach.
I think this ties into what you're saying, Dan, but adding to what you were talking about, Adrian, is being clear on what they expect from a leader, and the leader being clear on what the way that I talk about it is, I call it PVI, personal vested interest. That's an acronym that I use with my clients, because when my clients come and they start complaining about somebody that works for them, the first question I ask them, and we've already established what all this is and the power of it, I'd say, what's their PVI? And if they can tell me clearly what the PVI is, then we have a place to start, right? Because they're clear on what that person's personal vested interest. Why are they there? And what do they expect? How do they expect the mission of the company to contribute to their PVI? Then we can get somewhere. Then we have a common conversation and maybe a little bit of insight of why they're behaving the way they're behaving and what's missing, or at least an invitation to the conversation to find out what's missing for them. And I think that's I just think that's so brilliant, as both of you bring this up, is like, that seems to be one of the conversations most missing in this conversation about how do we lead them? They're lazy, they're entitled, they want quick pay, they want quick advancement without doing the work. All of that. So it just seems like that's the missing conversation of what are they here for? How does this contribute to their personal vested interests, what they're creating in their life?
Well, I think it has huge cultural implications. I think you're going to see, the forms of government and the exercise of the distribution of resources that have gone historically up until now are proving dramatically insufficient for this generation and going forward, which means you're going to see a reinvention of what it means to be in business, because they're far more socially conscious and environmentally conscious than the generations that have led up to now. And some of it's because, things have been over catastrophized, and some of it is because they've been under catastrophized. Like there's places where there's greater conflict than is being communicated, or greater need than is being communicated. And there are some places where there's this almost urgency, it's almost a frantic urgency when that's really not the case. And I think as they mature and as they take leadership, we're going to see some really, I think, transformational expressions of what it means to do business and what it means to live in a community. Because I think the crises that we're facing, the crises that we're facing, are going to be inherited by this generation. And our mistakes and our successes are going to be their inheritance. So I just think there's something to that. I think you're either going to get depressed if you're in Gen Z, or you're going to get excited about the contribution you can make. But that's going to have a lot to do with the kind of mentorship they get from the generations before. Because it's radically moving. I mean, we've seen, just look over the last 3 years, how the culture's changed and what's going on, right?
Yeah, I think that's great. I remember it used to be a guy named Tim Sanders. You guys know Tim Sanders? He was an early, business cultural expert. Maybe he fit like in the Seth Godin camp, or anyway, had an early platform. I remember listening to him on a podcast. I think he's called Love. I think he wrote a book called Love is the Killer App. He was like early at Yahoo. Anyway, and I remember listening in an interview to this, and I'll wrap quickly. He was talking about a book. This was probably 15 years ago. He was talking about a book called Bowling Alone. And it was pointing out around loneliness in the crowd. And I remember, and that, which is, true, I think, phenomenologically for people, is feeling disconnected, even in a crowded room. And he made this assertion back then, 15 years ago, that we're talking about right now, and it's really showing up in Gen Z, which is the shift for companies to be for good instead of merely for profit. Mm-hmm. Because this generation, more than anybody, wants to know their meaning. They're like seeking meaning. Yeah. And like for something to matter, and something, I'm not going to sell out and go work for this thing for 15 years to maybe get the life I want. No, I want the life I want now. Mm-hmm. And that's comes off like entitled, because other people paid the price for 15 years to go become partner. And these are saying, no, I want to have the life a partner has now, which is a meaning conversation, not a conversation about process. So it comes up. It's like, I'll just wrap here that we've got something to learn from this generation, which is they want to live right now. And they're not willing to be as compartmentalized as previous generations have been, where it's like, here's my work and here's my life. And I'll just let work be work, and I'll get the best I can out of the minimum time I have in this thing called life. And otherwise I'll just go, do some work over here. And they're looking about how to integrate it all now. So, so if you champion that value, if you champion it and don't judge it and listen to it and integrate it, it actually has something to teach the rest of the organization.
Yeah. And then it'll be possible to pass the wisdom of the ages on to the generation, because otherwise they're going to reject things that they're going to have to relearn because we didn't care enough to connect.
Right on.
That's right. Great conversation. I love this. We just scratched this surface. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I love both of you. Appreciate you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Well, my friends, thank you so much for listening to yet another conversation on the Naked Leadership Podcast. Your listenership and commitment to the podcast means the world to us. If this podcast or these conversations has helped or inspired you in any way, would you mind going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a 5-star rating and a glowing review? This helps us grow the movement and reach more leaders and teams. Finally, the greatest compliment that you can give us is sharing the podcast with your teams and the other leaders in your life. Until next week, bye-bye everybody.